Great. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the launch of the KnowTheChain 2023 Food and Beverage Benchmark Findings. People are still filtering in, but as we've got quite a busy schedule, I'm just going to start off with a couple of bits of housekeeping. So my name is Anja Clark and I'm head of KnowTheChain and investor strategy for the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. I'm joined by my colleague, senior researcher Rosie Monaghan, and an expert panel who will talk us through today's findings. Before I get started, I wanted to run through some housekeeping. The session will run for about 75 minutes, the first 30 minutes of which will be a presentation of the food and beverage benchmark findings. The second 30 minutes will be dedicated to a panel discussion with key partners and allies before leaving 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please do keep yourselves on mute for the session. And if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or pop a message in the chat box, and we will endeavour to answer them during the question and answer session at the end. The session is being recorded for those who can't make it today. And if you have any technical issues, my colleagues and I will endeavour to resolve them as soon as possible. I just wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our wonderful panel of speakers who will help us dig deeper into the findings today. So Anja Seiler is an ESG engagement specialist at Swiss-based responsible investor Ethos Foundation. In this role, Anja is responsible for conducting dialogues with listed companies across sectors to improve their sustainability, ambition and performance. She's mostly focused on social topics related to human and labour rights in global supply chains. Before joining Ethos, she worked with an NGO providing capacity building on conflict-sensitive project management, including human rights-based approaches in a number of high-risk contexts. Ethos Foundation is also a long-standing signatory to the Investor Alliance and KnowTheChain Statement on Forced Labour, and a lead investor in the KnowTheChain ICCR collaborative engagement focused on improving human rights performance of apparel and footwear sector companies. Joe Martinez is the CEO and co-founder of ethical labour contractor and consultancy CIERTO Global. Joe has dedicated his career to creating frameworks that allow for communication and cooperation between US, Mexican, Guatemalan state governments, worker communities of origin, North American growers, international retailers, and labour representatives. A key component of his work has included the establishment of transparent, ethical labour agreements that create strong return on investment for growers while protecting migrant farm workers from fraud and trafficking. And last but not least, Rachel Cowburn-Walden, Global Head of Sustainability Human Rights at Unilever, leading the company's overall human rights strategy, policy, reporting and advocacy. She's been working at Unilever since 2008 and held positions in external affairs, supply chains, and the global sustainability function where she now sits. Prior to joining Unilever, she spent 12 years in UK politics, including in the Prime Minister's political office in 10 Downing Street, and as head of international relations for the Labour Party. Unilever is one of the longest standing benchmark companies and ranks among the top 5 in this year's benchmark. And just a brief note about who we are. So KnowTheChain is a program of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. We are a tool for companies and investors to understand and address forced labour risks within their global supply chains. We use benchmarking as a tool to identify and share best practice, and as a way to create a race to the top that encourages companies to adopt standards and practices that protect worker well-being. We benchmark 60 of the largest companies by market capitalization across 3 high-risk sectors, so food and beverage, apparel and footwear, and ICT. And since 2016, KnowTheChain has produced 11 separate benchmarks on 180 companies across those 3 sectors. Our methodology focuses on measuring and incentivizing disclosure of policy implementation rather than the mere existence of a policy per se, and how those policies result in positive outcomes for workers. And we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail during the findings. But before I get into those, I just wanted to outline what it is that we mean by forced labor and how and why it manifests in food supply chains. So the International Labour Organization has identified 11 indicators of forced labor, which at its core is about a person performing work under threat or penalty under conditions which are not voluntary. A few themes to look out for are workers threatened into taking work they otherwise wouldn't, like making excessive or not adequately paid overtime a condition of keeping at their job, meaning workers therefore spend hours doing work that is not voluntary. Is there an element of entrapment? This could be physical restrictions on movement and could also be debt, such as when workers are required to pay recruitment fees to get a job, which can often amount to weeks or even months of their wages. And deceit, being promised one job by a recruiter only to find that they've been recruited for a different job upon arrival in the country of work, or taking on overtime under the impression that it will be compensated. The food and beverage sector is particularly prone to forced labor due to the nature of the work. According to the ILO, there are currently 27.6 million people in situations of forced labor around the world. And agriculture accounts for the fourth largest share of forced labor by sector globally. Crop growing is labor intensive and food processing often involves low-skilled manual labor. Vulnerable groups, such as minorities and migrant workers, are overrepresented in the sector, many dependent on their employer for accommodation in remote locations, which increase their vulnerability. Many farm workers are also part of the informal economy and offer lower wages than other sectors and adopt piece rate payment systems. The lack of adequate labour legislation or inconsistencies in its enforcement expose many workers to exploitative practices in both high and low income countries, as recent allegations of forced labour of blueberry growers in the US, migrant workers on Mexican and UK fruit farms, and Moroccan workers in the Spanish agricultural sector make plain. And since the last benchmark in 2022, the global context facing forced labour risks in the food and beverage sector has evolved in a number of ways. So firstly, the increase in intensity and severity of extreme weather events in exacerbating the plight of workers in the food value chain by forcing victims to migrate and often work under precarious conditions around the world, including amid floods, extreme heat, and in associated unsafe working conditions. Secondly, recent and ongoing conflicts and political instability augment the vulnerability of workers to forced labor. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Syria, and economic turmoil in Venezuela have left thousands of refugees and others who are destitute and desperate for work at an increased risk of exploitation. And thirdly, the cost of living crisis, which is pushing people into poverty, increasing food insecurity, and in turn making them more susceptible to exploitation and abuse by unscrupulous employers. As farms struggle with increased costs, some employers might be tempted to push workers' wages down or engage in exploitative labour practices to cover the distance. But these actions are happening against a counterwave of increasing due diligence legislation like that in the EU, supply chain transparency acts in Germany and Norway, and a second wave of modern slavery acts with enforcement teeth in the UK, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia, and import bans in the US and soon the EU, which, as the benchmarks results will show, are desperately needed to level the playing field in terms of company approaches to this issue. And against this challenging backdrop, we have measured how companies are addressing forced labour in their supply chains. And with that, I will now hand over to my colleague Rosie to take us through those findings. Thank you, Rosie.
Thanks, Anja, and thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. So we're kicking this off with the benchmark ranking of our 60 food and beverage companies. And apologies that it's probably quite difficult to make out all the company names, but this will give you a sense of how vast the range of scores in the sector are. So the average score for the sector is 16 out of 100. 50% of companies assessed scored below 10 out of 100, and the highest scoring company scored 56. So it drops quite rapidly in the first half of the ranking. There were high and low scoring companies across all regions included in the benchmark. Regions with the largest number of companies assessed include Asia, Europe, and North America. Asian companies scored 8 out of 100 on average, European companies 21, and North American companies scored 17. And if we move to the next slide. So KnowTheChain's benchmark methodology is comprised of 7 themes, which are broadly aligned with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, with theme 1 covering commitment, themes 2 to 6 covering various forms of due diligence, and theme 7 covering remedy. And this graph shows the average score of the sector per benchmark theme. Companies scored highest on the theme of commitment and governance, which includes things like a supplier code of conduct addressing the ILO core labor standards, internal responsibility and governance of that code, and training and capacity building. This is followed by traceability and risk assessment with an average score of 18 out of 100, which assesses traceability and supply chain transparency at first tier, below first tier, and raw material level across high-risk commodities, and how companies conduct a human rights risk assessment on their supply chains. Companies performed poorest on the themes of purchasing practices, worker voice, and remedy. And we will dig into some of these findings a bit more in the following slides, but to highlight some key areas, we saw gaps. Only 5% of companies disclosed data points that demonstrate responsible purchasing practices. 8% of companies disclosed working with unions to support or improve freedom of association in their supply chains, and 8% of companies disclosed remedy outcomes for suppliers' workers. So moving on to where we've seen progress since our last benchmark in 2020. A total of 41 of the companies assessed this year were also fully benchmarked in 2020. So we have a relatively large sample from which we can measure progress. Overall, we did see that a significant portion of companies didn't demonstrate progress or improvement since the 2020 assessment. Almost a third of companies disclosed no improvements. Our methodology changes since the 2020 benchmark have had an impact on company scores when compared with previous years, as policies are now underweighted and more focus is given to the implementation of those policies and programs and the outcomes they result in. This has lowered company scores across the board. But when analysing these score drops, we found that companies we'd assessed for the longest, since 2016, had the largest score drops on average. And in particular, if we look at where we've seen no progress at all, companies JBS, Tyson, and FEMSA have all been benchmarked by us since 2016 and haven't demonstrated improvement in this time. But we did see stronger improvement from some companies, including Hershey and Smucker, Suntory Food and Beverage, which improved its score from 8 in 2020 to 32 this year, and Woolworths, which increased from 52 to 56, despite the methodology changes. Thematically, we saw the strongest improvements on our risk assessment indicator, which may signal that companies are strengthening their due diligence ahead of increasing regulation. A fifth of companies disclosed improvements related to human rights risk assessments. 5 companies disclosed how they conduct their human rights risk assessment for the first time, and 4 disclosed stronger detail on their process, such as the sources used or types of relevant stakeholders engaged to identify risks. And 8 companies improved on the disclosure of forced labour risks identified. And while companies performed relatively poorly overall on the theme of recruitment, we did see some companies demonstrating an increased focus on recruitment-related issues. 6 companies either adopted a policy for the first time or strengthened their existing policy to include the employer pays principle. And 5 companies disclosed the repayment of recruitment-related fees to supply chain workers for the first time. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'll talk through findings in relation to 3 key areas that we presented in our report. Those are responsible recruitment of migrant workers, human rights due diligence, and remedy. And I'll outline our findings in each area and then talk through some good practice examples as well. So if we move to the next slide, we can begin with recruitment. So as we saw in the graph earlier, companies scored an average of 13 on the theme of recruitment. We have 2 key indicators within this theme, one which focuses on recruitment fees and related costs in particular, with one element assessing policy, one assessing preventative measures to ensure workers don't pay fees in the first instance, and one ensuring remediation of fees to supply chain workers where they have paid fees. The second indicator focuses on broader efforts to support responsible recruitment in global supply chains, including tracing of labour agencies used by suppliers and working with relevant stakeholders on responsible recruitment. So this could include training suppliers and recruitment agencies on ethical recruitment, supporting the development of ethical recruitment schemes, or engaging policymakers to improve recruitment standards, for example. So looking firstly at those steps to support responsible recruitment, 27% of companies disclose taking these steps, and we'll take a look at some good practices shortly. 12% of companies disclosed how they trace labour agencies used by their suppliers. This is surprisingly low, as this is a key step to being able to understand recruitment-related risks in supply chains and where those risks lie. And similarly, we saw a gap between those companies which specifically identified migrant workers as a high-risk group in their supply chains and those demonstrating an understanding of how many migrant workers were in their supply chains. So while 38% of companies identified migrant workers as high risk, only 7% of companies disclosed data on the number or percentage of migrant workers in their supply chains. In relation to recruitment fees, 50% of companies disclosed a policy prohibiting recruitment fees in their supply chains, which is low in and of itself, but is also comparatively low when compared with the ICT sector, for example, where 85% of companies disclose such a policy. And disappointingly, this figure drops lower to 28% when looking at which policies specifically include the employer pays principle or require that workers are repaid, as such outlining that the employer, not the worker, is responsible for paying recruitment-related fees. There is a further gap to be seen between companies disclosing a policy and those disclosing how this policy is implemented. So only 12% of companies clearly outlined due diligence steps taken to prevent the charging of fees to supply chain workers. The types of steps we're looking for here include mapping labour agencies used in supply chains, mapping migrant worker journeys and fee amounts charged in different migration corridors, specialised monitoring for fees paid by workers, and examples of how suppliers have implemented the employer pays principle by paying agencies directly. And what this seems to suggest then is that half the sector appears not to be paying attention to the issue of recruitment fees, and then a group of companies of a more limited size appear to be leading the way with more substantial efforts at both policy level and in terms of policy implementation. And with risks to migrant workers and seasonal workers so frequently reported in recent allegations, it is concerning that such a large portion of the sector doesn't demonstrate stronger due diligence in relation to the protection of migrant workers. And now, in terms of some of the good practices we saw on recruitment, firstly, in terms of fee prevention and remediation, Woolworths disclosed due diligence steps to prevent fees, which included tracing of labour providers used by both suppliers and growers in Australian horticultural supply chains, and disclosed the number of agencies identified, showing how this process is working in practice. It also outlined a process for identifying labour recruiters used by suppliers in Thailand and Malaysia, and provided data on the fee repayments being made to workers by suppliers, and outlined the stakeholders it's working with, including local NGOs, to determine the remediation owed to workers. Tesco outlined policy requirements that said suppliers in Thailand and Malaysia must obtain a clear understanding of the processes and costs associated with migrant worker recruitment and set time-bound action plans for moving to an employer pays model. It reported working with the ISERA Institute to verify how suppliers were implementing this policy, and also worked with ISERA to ensure the remediation of more than $400,000 to workers in Thailand and Malaysia. Looking at those broader efforts to enable responsible recruitment in supply chains, Unilever disclosed examples across supply chain contexts. So, for example, it has implemented a responsible recruitment capacity building initiative for suppliers in several countries. It also disclosed a project focused on hazelnut crop in Turkey, which involved training for labour agencies on responsible recruitment and agency registration. This was a collaborative project with suppliers, producers, labour intermediaries, and worker groups. The company also disclosed collaborative efforts relating to the implementation of zero fees in palm oil, which will involve mapping exercises, analysing national recruitment industries in Malaysia and key origin countries, and developing a plan for zero fee implementation and how this can be cost shared. And another example under our responsible recruitment indicator came from Costco, which reported working with CIERTO, who we will hear more from today, as well as working to build demand for ethical recruitment practices in the seafood sector. And if we move to the next slide. So a large amount of our methodology covers human rights due diligence, but I'm going to focus on 3 key areas here. So traceability, stakeholder engagement, and risk assessment. So beginning with traceability, KnowTheChain assesses whether companies disclose supplier lists, first tier and beyond, the sourcing countries of high-risk commodities at raw material level, and approximate data on supply chain workforce, such as percentages of women and migrant workers. As the companies that we assess source 7 high-risk commodities on average, we look for traceability and transparency disclosure in relation to at least 3 high-risk commodities. So what we found is that 82% of companies are yet to disclose a first-tier supplier list. And of the 18% with relevant disclosure, this tends to be a mix between commodity-specific first-tier supplier lists or full first-tier supplier lists in the case of Sainsbury's and Tesco. 23% disclosed the names and locations of below first-tier suppliers for at least 1 commodity. This was most commonly palm oil mills. And at raw material level, 7% disclosed the sourcing countries of at least 3 high-risk commodities, with an additional 41% disclosing partial information or efforts to trace those commodities at raw material level. So as such, there is a significant portion of the sector not yet demonstrating an understanding of where they are sourcing from. And in addition, we found that when comparing with data from 2020, several companies who had reported efforts to trace particular commodities didn't give follow-up disclosure or disclose outcomes of those tracing efforts this year. Stakeholder engagement is assessed in several indicators of our methodology, but I'll just hone in on these 2 key points. When assessing whether companies engage with unions or legitimate worker representatives to improve freedom of association in their supply chains, only 8% of companies disclose such engagements, indicating a significant gaps in efforts to support workers' right to organise. And 12% of companies clearly outlined how stakeholders, including workers, unions, or civil society organisations, were engaged as part of understanding risks. And I'll give a couple of examples of this shortly. If we move to the next slide. So on human rights risk assessments, as I outlined earlier, we did identify this as an area of strong improvement since the 2020 benchmark. But even so, looking at the sector as a whole, more than 1/3 has yet to disclose how it conducts a human rights risk assessment on its supply chains. Detail on the disclosure of risk was particularly limited. So while 45% of companies disclosed some information on the forced labour risks they identified, those disclosing detail on risks identified across supply chain tiers was more limited at 17%. This is quite a gap, as reporting on the risks identified through these assessments shows that companies have an understanding of actual and potential impacts on workers, as well as where to prioritise their due diligence efforts. We also noticed some disparity between the disclosure of risk and the commodities that companies source, so as shown in these 2 graphics at the bottom of the slide. So while 80% of companies source palm oil, only 20% of companies disclosed the associated forced labour risks with palm oil. And the same disparity could be seen with other commodities such as fish and seafood. So on good practices, firstly, in terms of human rights risk assessments, Woolworths disclosed detail on the forced labour risks it had identified in terms of locations, commodities, and supply chain tiers. It defined risk levels for several countries and commodities, including Australian horticultural commodities and those outside of horticulture, including seafood and bulk dry commodities. Suntory on supply chain transparency demonstrated a good understanding of both risk indicators and the demographics of its supply chain workforce by disclosing the percentage of women and migrant workers in its supply chains. It also reported tracking additional indicators related to women, such as the ratio of female managers, whether anti-discrimination policies are in place, and the rates of absenteeism and turnover for women workers. And one example of stakeholder engagement as part of assessing and addressing risks came from Coles, which carried out an assessment into accommodation, which involved interviews with seasonal workers and union representatives. And I did want to mention, you can also find good examples of stakeholder engagement and strong risk disclosure across supply chain tiers from Ajinomoto, Hershey, Unilever and Woolworths in our full data set. And finally, on remedy. Firstly, in terms of access to remedy, we found that most companies at 72% disclose at least one grievance mechanism open to supply chain workers, but significantly fewer companies can show that these mechanisms are effective and used by supply chain workers by disclosing data on their use. KnowTheChain also assesses whether companies disclose remedy outcomes for supply chain workers. This could include, for example, repayments addressing shortfalls in wages or recruitment fee reimbursement, returning passports to workers. And this is one indicator where we assess how companies have responded to broader labour rights violations beyond forced labour only. Even so, only 8% of companies disclosed information on remedy outcomes for workers. This 8% represents only 5 companies, indicating poor performance on remedy. And we also identified that in response to specific allegations of forced labour in company supply chains, no company disclosed engaging with the stakeholders concerned in the allegations. Fortunately, we did identify some examples of better practice. So if we move to the next slide. So firstly, on grievance mechanisms, something that we notice across the sectors we benchmark is that grievance mechanisms are often not very clearly signposted for who they are intended for. Coles was an exception to this and discloses 2 separate grievance mechanisms, one for supply chain workers and one for other affected stakeholders. It also disclosed data on the use of these mechanisms. On remedy outcomes, Wilmar disclosed, for example, the repayment of recruitment fees to workers in its supply chains and describes that workers were given access to raise concerns around the remediation process, and a committee was set up by the supplier to oversee the remediation. It disclosed the number of current and former workers repaid. And finally, Woolworths disclosed the number of passports returned to migrant workers in its supply chains, recruitment fee remediation data, and 2 cases where workers were paid below the minimum wage or had wages deducted as a disciplinary measure. It states remediation included repayments to the impacted workers, updated worker contracts, and team training on wage deductions. And that's our key findings wrapped up. So Anja, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks so much, Rosie, and right on time. You managed to fit everything in. Thank you so much. Great. I'll invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras on for a discussion of the findings now. And I'm really interested to hear from you all about your reflections on the findings. And Rachel, maybe I'll start with you as a participating company and practitioner on this.
Thanks, Anja. And I think for everyone listening to the findings, it's really clear that all businesses need to do more and need to do better in terms of addressing forced labour in global value chains. I really welcome and understand the importance of the focus on implementation. I think we do need to move beyond companies simply having a policy, really being able to report back on how that policy or those policies are being implemented. And also, of course, that focus on impact and outcome. And that's certainly something that at Unilever we're working on, also understanding how can we better engage with rights holders. Sometimes that is more difficult because the workers are not our direct workers, so they are several tiers up the supply chain. But of course, nonetheless, it's absolutely critical to understand and hear from the workers themselves. So we are engaging with a third-party organisation that has lots of experience in this work to help us understand how we can better engage with rights holders, in this case, particularly around migrant workers. And also, as shown in the benchmark, really understanding the impact. So also doing some work with the third party to really understand the impact of the remediation of recruitment fees. And as our modern slavery statement says, just in 3 cases, our suppliers have paid back about €1 million in terms of paid recruitment fees. But of course, absolutely much more needs to be done, as I said at the start.
Thanks, Rachel. I might hand it now to Joe just to give initial reflections on the findings from your perspective.
No, thank you so much. Just like my colleague Rachel said, I'm not surprised by the findings. I think the reality, as an organization that's dedicated to ethical recruitment and has been constituted since 2014, it has been a real challenge in the marketplace for us to be able to have a foothold. The reality is that these findings demonstrate that responsible recruitment is not connected to purchasing practices. Therefore, it has not become standard business practice. And that challenge will continue. But I agree a lot with what Rachel just said. We need to start to create mechanisms that demonstrate continuous improvement. How are folks demonstrating compliance? I think one of the aspects when I look at responsible recruitment, remediation, worker voice, one of the initial starts is recruitment. If a worker has paid for the right to come to any type of job, they're going to sacrifice their voice and they're going to sacrifice remediation to ensure that they can continue to earn wages to pay off the debt that they accrued to come to that job. And some of the challenges that we're facing as an organization is that there aren't many ethical recruiters out there in the world. I have focused strongly on trying to create an ecosystem of actors that exist, ethical recruiters that exist. And it's been a true challenge to be able to find folks that are trying to adopt these practices and work within the supply chains. I think recruitment as a whole has been an industry that's existed within the shadows. And when we look at the food and beverage sector, it has been a reality where we react to the issues that exist, but have been very hard pressed. And it's been difficult for a lot of these companies to find solutions and examples that are leading the way and demonstrating the change. And a part of that, I think, comes to how do you start to create mechanisms? How do you start to create mechanisms within the supply chains that reward folks that are doing the right things, that are actually doing the mechanisms of worker voice, that are doing responsible recruitment and are able to provide you that data? But once again, there are companies that we work with. We're very happy with our partnership with Costco. We're starting to work with Walmart folks within their vendors within North America. But once again, the true cost of recruitment is very expensive. And for many recruiters in this industry, they subsidize that off the back of workers. And when folks don't know what the true cost of recruitment is, it's very difficult to know whether or not you're having responsible recruitment in your supply chain. And so some of the efforts that we're trying to expound on is really giving retailers as well as growers, companies, the real data that demonstrates what it costs to bring workers to their companies. But outside of that as well, we know that there have been various different initiatives. There's different work that's going on. One of the things that we're really looking to support is the Ethical Charter in the United States, where we're finally going to see a platform of resources, responsible recruitment being one of the areas that's focused on this ethical charter. And how do we start to demonstrate whether or not companies that provide products to the food and beverage sector, if they're in compliance? How do we start to demonstrate that they're actually taking the steps to improve? Another one of the stronger challenges we also have is the fact that most companies are not in a place to want to demonstrate the issues that exist within their recruitment. Many times that can be a challenge and an issue for them to continue to operate and have business with these companies. So how do we shift the paradigm to recognize folks that are identifying the issues that exist and then honoring and recognizing their effort to remediate these issues? Whereas right now, a lot of that has to happen outside of the recognition of responsible recruitment, which continues to be a challenge for that to become a standard business practice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. And there's so many themes and issues that you've touched on there. I think that that issue around disclosure and not willing to kind of, demonstrate or, show issues and challenges within this very, very complex topic, recruitment and labor issues is one of those. I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit more detail when we talk about transparency later on. But Anja, from an investor perspective, I just wanted to get your initial thoughts on the findings.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Anja. I agree with what Rachel and Joy were highlighting. I think the results overall are very disappointing, also considering the facts and figures that were mentioned in the beginning, the global estimates by the ILO. We see that in the most recent report by 2021, actually the global estimates of people living in conditions of forced labor are going up, and they should be going down. There is a lot being done already, but it's not enough. And I think also from an investor perspective, we need to be very mindful of what we ask companies for when we engage with them. I think especially regarding the food and agri sector, the food and beverage sector, we focus a lot on scope 3 emissions. It's very relevant because the food and agri systems are responsible for 31% of human cost greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously that's very material, but we also should not only focus on greenhouse gas emission reduction, on biodiversity and deforestation, on healthy diets for all. That's all very relevant, but we really need to start having more integrated ways of talking to companies, of our investor expectations. We need to all the time bring in social aspects, because everything in the end is interlinked, and we really need to stop thinking in silos and work much more on human rights topics.
Thank you so much, Anja. And yeah, again, we'll be digging into that in a little bit more detail in terms of how investors engage with this topic and what they're asking of companies. But I wanted to jump back to something that Joe asked previously around, the identification of risks. And Rachel, I know the chain, we operate on the premise that forced labor risks and impacts exist within every supply chain. And so it is concerning when we see kind of the low scores in terms of risk assessment and companies not disclosing methodologies and not connecting the dots between, high risk commodity sourcing and then risk assessments in place for those commodities. Maybe you could just give us a little more insight into the challenges that companies are facing in terms of identifying instances of forced labor and then publicly disclosing on those risks and impacts.
Well, I think the first challenge is exactly how you said, is actually identification. And we know that audits can identify some elements of human rights impacts, abuses, but forced labor, it's very difficult. And as Joe has said, workers have a lot to lose, unfortunately, often for stepping up and saying when issues are arising and where there are concerns and where there are negative impacts. And so that's why companies such as Unilever, but not just Unilever, also looking at other ways that can really identify those more difficult issues. So as I've mentioned, by engaging directly with workers outside of an audit process, but whether it's doing impact assessments or whether it's actually using organizations or working with organizations such as DigiNext to actually speak to workers directly. And we are finding the issues that haven't been identified in audits are being identified through other means. You mentioned, and trade unions, as mentioned in the report, absolutely critical as well. So I think it's that identification, first of all. And if you take something like recruitment fees, it is also very difficult to track down at every stage of that recruitment journey where fees have been paid, right from perhaps the local village to actually arriving within the country. And so that's why actually, as Joe rightly says, we have to really create a whole industry approach and really relook at the whole recruitment industry. We need to change the whole system. It is complex for businesses. Of course, the most important thing, it's really bad for workers, and we need to stop those real indicators of forced labor by the large amounts of recruitment fees are paid. It is also complex where fees are paid at different stages, but we have to, as business, as industry, find some way of really addressing this. Of course, we can't do it just as business. We have to do it with the guidance of civil society and expert organizations, and as I said, migrant workers themselves, and also with governments. Because of course, as we know, there are some recruitment fees that are allowed by governments, which is an added layer of complexity when it comes to to compliance with various policies. So we just need to take a step back, and we don't want to be having this discussion in the next 5 years' time, and hopefully not much sooner than that.
Yeah, and I guess that enabling environment, the worker empowerment, the worker education in origin and destination countries is a hugely important part of that. Joe, I just wanted to check if you wanted to come in on anything that Rachel said there before moving to the next question.
No, I completely agree with what Rachel said. I think the reality is that an ecosystem needs to exist. The actors are there, but we haven't been able to come together, to work together. I mean, one of the challenges that I face is within the recruitment industry is that a lot of folks don't want to disclose their fees, and they actually compete with one another to be the cheapest labor provider. And in reality, what happens is that we're not seeing a transparent and true cost of recruitment. And that continues to plague the food and beverage industry. And I think it goes hand in hand. There is a responsibility for the food and beverage industry to find companies that can help them and within compliance, but when there aren't many companies out there that can do that, the challenge is very difficult. And I think that in reality, one of the issues that I think we've recognized as CIERTO Global is that we need to also not only be a recruiter, but work as a consultant to assist other labor recruiters in moving and shifting into the ethical recruitment space. Some of the challenges that we see and that we know is supply chains are not going to halt their operations. There is a massive amount of demand that's required for them to fulfill. And so how can we create solutions that are scalable in a manner that allow these companies to actually take this issue and be able to adjust and deal with it? And I think that we continue to face this challenge as a company that's looking to make an impact and shift this paradigm. But the reality is that we're one of maybe 900 recruiters that are registered within the United States. And the reality continues to remain. Coming from a union myself, the United Farm Workers, we saw that it's difficult for unions to engage with a lot of the workers within the supply chain. And from that, I was tasked with creating an ethical and responsible recruitment solution, because we know that over the last decade, at least within the North American context, migration has continued to increase, and the need to have a legal workforce that's coming through legal and justifiable migration pathways has been a true challenge. And so I think with that, we were recognizing that, and I'm happy to say that due to technology, companies are being more and more pressured to have to find remediation and solutions to these problems, because workers are now starting to have tools to be able to not only use their voice, but further demonstrate the issues they're having to deal with. And so workers are prepared to be able to use worker voice mechanisms, but there needs to be some sort of relational context built for them to build trust that companies are truly interested in hearing their input. And that's where the real challenge happens, is the notion that when CIERTO engages any company, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a 1 to 3 year process to truly build worker engagement and start to see the fruit of that work come forward. And so as we continue, I implore all of these companies to look at mechanisms on how not only are they engaging responsible recruitment, but what are the mechanisms that are demonstrating that workers are utilizing this to have a continuous feedback loop. And these are some of the challenges that we see. I do think it's very difficult to have this all assessed within an audit or within a specific report, because it's easy to prepare for those. But what is difficult is to see the continuous improvement of these applications year in and year out. And as a responsible recruiter, it is difficult. We're dealing with humans, not commodities. I can't just return this commodity because it's not going to give me the shelf life that I need. No, they're individuals that have requirements and that most of the time are also looking for their own self-interest. So how can we align all of these interests to recognize the value that they bring to the supply chain and be recognized for that, and that companies can come together to be able to support these worker voice mechanisms that really begin at the village and in the communities of origin, which is responsible recruitment. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And yeah, I mean, from the findings that you've seen there in terms of grievance mechanisms, companies having a grievance mechanism that is accessible to supply chain workers, and then a number that can demonstrate that that those mechanisms are being used by workers. I think the discrepancy there between the policy and practice is something that you've spoken about, or you've alluded to there. And then I guess it's the incentive structures as well, Joe, which you kind of mentioned before. What is the true cost of recruitment? Demonstrating that are companies willing to pay for it. So I just want to jump to kind of Anja. We mentioned the challenges on the company side of identifying and analyzing kind of forced labor, but it must be very difficult for you as an investor to analyze kind of corporate disclosures and then, you know, engage companies on forced labor. Are there specific metrics that you're focusing on? Are you solely focused on the materiality aspect of forced labor, or how do you square that within, you know, focusing on kind of the moral and the business case, I guess, for this within investment analysis?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Anja. Indeed, it's not so easy actually to have a methodology that can capture forced labor risks. At the Ethos Foundation, just a couple of background words, we have quite a lot of freedom in the sense that we belong to the Swiss pension funds, and we don't rely on any large ESG data provider, but we have really the means and the freedom to develop our own ESG methodology to rank companies. And it's currently under revision, and it already is aligned, of course, with international standards, and double materiality, of course, is very important to us. I mean, there are many metrics we look at regarding human rights more broadly, but then when it comes to forced labor in particular, we also follow quite a lot the KnowTheChain framework. We start with, is there a policy in place, which is of course the easiest one to reply to. Does it cover, does the policy on forced labor, on labor rights also cover forced and compulsory labor? And then there's many other indicators relating to employee turnover, voluntary and overall, share of temporary workers. We look at new employee hires, use of recruiting agencies. We look at disclosure of tier 1 suppliers and also beyond. Is there any names and addresses available of these suppliers? Then we also look at the grievance mechanism, of course. Is it accessible not only to own employees, but to all stakeholders, to the communities as well? What are total number of grievances, which how many have been filed, how many have been addressed and resolved? We also have some metrics on responsible purchasing practices and so on. There's many others. Then we also, of course, look at supplier code of conduct. What are the requirements for suppliers, and how is also the burden sharing between suppliers and buyers? So all the responsible purchasing practices again. I think that there is really one big problem for us as investor to assess companies on forced labor risk, because some of the key data points we need to assess companies are just not there. We don't see them, they are not disclosed. And I just mentioned some as I highlighted these metrics. For example, cases of forced labor that are raised through a grievance mechanism are usually classified, if they are classified at all. Sometimes you just see in the disclosure, oh, we have had 122 grievances reported through the grievance mechanism, but you have no idea what the topic was about, right? And sometimes you have a classification where you see, okay, there have been 27 cases on human rights, but then also you don't have forced labor cases singled out, right? So it's all together in a package very often. We still have companies that say they don't have any cases of forced labor and any cases coming through the grievance mechanism, which is really a red flag for us. And then also the same is also true when we look at remediation of recruitment fees. We talked a lot about recruitment fees. Oftentimes there is simply no information how much has been paid, who has been paid, and what are really outcomes for workers, right? Because as investors, we want to be sure that there is a feedback mechanism for reports that are received through the grievance mechanism to improve internal practices, so really management systems at companies, but also for workers. And very often this information is not there. And we see companies do have most of the time this information, but they are not ready to disclose it if they don't have to. We see that many companies are very much in favor also of a level playing field, of really having legislation telling them they have to do it now, because then there can be a discussion. If I am a chocolate trader and I have 25,000 cases of forced labor and child labor in 2 countries, so I may be classified as a laggard because that can be really a high number. But if all the others have to disclose the number 2, there can really be a discussion about, is this really a good or a bad indicator of how to address forced labor risk? Does it mean they just look closer into the supply chain, or that workers feel more empowered to actually raise such grievances?
Thanks so much, Anja. And I see Rachel nodding. I just want to come in and see if you have a response to that, because I know there's a tension between, you know, investors maybe particularly asking for more disclosure and you know, the market and different stakeholders, and I guess what a company is prepared to disclose themselves, and how do you kind of strike that balance between, you know, disclosure and transparency, but also kind of, you know, a more compliance-based approach in terms of what you can disclose, you know, or what you feel like you can disclose legally.
I mean, I think there's always more that we can disclose. We at Unilever have always tried to disclose as much as we can from a human rights perspective. So we were the first company to publish a standalone human rights report for the UN Guiding Principles framework, reporting framework back in 2015. I think certainly the ask, including from investors, is much more going towards quantitative disclosure and reporting rather than qualitative. That's always a bit harder, but something that we know we need to do, and we need to focus on impact. It's not a bad thing, disclosure and transparency. And I think if it also encourages others to disclose and to create that level playing field, which is important, which is why we have always supported human rights due diligence legislation. But I think it's important to report, because then we can learn from each other. I think we have to be pragmatic and realistic. It's an absolute red flag to me as well if any company says they don't have issues around forced labor or child labor or other negative human rights impacts in their value chain. The question is, though, what are you doing about it? And that's what companies need to disclose and continuously learn and follow best practice. Yes, there are concerns from some companies, but I think it's much better to disclose in a meaningful, pragmatic way. But as I say, it has to be meaningful disclosure. So it has to be, yes, we do have the issues. This is what we are doing about it, but also very much in a humble way that we know we need to do more and we need to learn in terms of how we address these issues.
And staying with you for a minute, Rachel, on governance, and it's not something that we pay or focus too much attention on within the benchmark, because it's one of those indicators that normally score relatively high. You know, companies will have some governance framework in place, but with Unilever, I know that, you know, the sustainability function is very much tied to the strategic direction of the business, and I wonder if you could just explain how, you know, that has come about within Unilever, and how important that is, and maybe a little bit about your role in this, the role of the sustainability professional now in shaping the strategy and feeding into the strategy of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think any company that is not looking at sustainability, and that's when I say sustainability, I mean social, environmental and economic sustainability, is not really focusing on the longevity of their business. It's absolutely critical for a business to be resilient and to be future fit. And that's why the Unilever Compass is absolutely our business commercial strategy. And we are a business, we want to be a winning business and we want to win with our brands, but sustainability is absolutely at the heart of that. And as I say, I think that's the only way that any business that wants to be here for the long term needs to operate. Now, this has to be something that is embedded and in everyone's job. So it can't just be something, and it isn't just something that is sort of work through at a global sustainability function. It has to be embedded completely across the business. And that's very much the way that, that Unilever works, because we see the benefit of doing that. And I think that is absolutely critical. And that's why you will see, and I think also the point that Anja made, we have to increasingly see environmental and social completely embedded. We do have to break down those silos. We can't talk about climate change without talking about the human impact of climate change. So that's why we as a business will have, yes, we'll have a climate transition action plan, but also we'll really focus on our social commitments around living wage and living income. And as you've said in the benchmark, the impact on migrant workers of climate change, they are going to disproportionately feel that impact. So, or to say that sustainability, complete part of our strategy, and absolutely needs to be for any business there for the long term.
Thank you, Rachel. And Joe, just going back to the topic of kind of responsible recruitment and recruitment fees more specifically, and you've alluded to this in other answers, but what would it mean to eradicate the charging of recruitment fees? Kind of what are the practical steps that need to be taken for companies to address this risk? And yeah, maybe that is starting with, you know, worker education empowerment in origin countries. But if you could just elaborate a little bit on that. Have we lost Joe? He might just have been cut off and will come back in hopefully shortly. Great. Okay, while he's coming back in, just another question then to finish off this kind of discussion panel with Anja. And I think you know, a key question and a key lever, I think, for KnowTheChain and for other stakeholders, we see investors as stewards of capital, as kind of holding a lot of you know, responsibility, but also power within companies to change corporate behaviors. You know, what do you see as investors' role in changing the behavior of corporates, and particularly on this issue in terms of forced labor in global supply chains?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think as responsible investors, we have a huge responsibility, as I pointed out in my opening remarks, really as a fiduciary duty to be carried out, and also really a big power to make companies aware of topics they may have not paid a lot of attention to. I think at the Ethos Foundation, we also use very often the tool of collaborative engagement initiatives. So we work together with other investors to really raise our voices and be heard at a board level. I think that gives us a lot of leverage, and then also as investors, I mean, if you have your investor expectations, they need to be realistic, they need to be feasible, and then if you are not happy really with how the dialogue is going, there is always the possibility to escalate, and there's really different forms that an escalation can take. We don't necessarily in the first place need to think about the divestment, but really, as I said, from a single engagement, you can go to a collaborative engagement. You can write letters to the board and express your disappointment, lack of progress. You can also vote against the board of directors. That's a very simple step to do. You can, if you, depending on its jurisdiction, if you have a really If you have a case, you can file shareholder resolutions. So I think there's really a lot to be done, and there's many instruments that we can use as investors to keep the companies really informed and place the agenda of place the topic of forced labor even higher on the agenda of companies.
Thanks so much, Anja. And Joe, I see you're back. I hope you can hear and see us okay. We can see you again. I just wanted I was going to ask you about the recruitment and what it would take to eradicate fees, but we might follow up with that because I know we're at time and we're going to jump to the Q&A now. But what I wanted to do was kind of if everybody could say kind of one recommendation or key takeaway from this discussion that they would leave the audience with, what would that be? And Joe, maybe I can start with you on that one.
Yes, no, thank you. Apologize, folks. Shoddy internet from Guatemala, but here and happy. I think one of the recommendations that I would push is that folks are able to further expand on recruiters that are certified through, whether it be the IRIS certification that's coming through the International Office of Migration and the International Labor Organization, that recruiters be able to demonstrate how they're adopting the ILO guiding principles around responsible recruitment. And last but not least, also the Clearview certification that exists, at least within the US context, which is Stronger Together. I think when you start to find recruiters that are adopting these principles and have these certifications, you're already one step ahead. And the reality is that it requires due diligence mechanisms that require you to have insight all the way to that first tier, which is the community of origins. And I think that really helps folks to be able to have better assurance with the recruitment processes. But once again, this is just one step. I think it's going to take a multitude of actions in various organizations to come together. Recruitment being one of the initial steps to ensure that workers can arrive without having paid any fees, where employer pays principal. But then it comes down to also having grievance mechanisms, worker voice mechanisms that allow folks that trust and believe that they can be heard. And so I think some of the true challenges, and I implore folks, is to really seek out who are their recruiters. Are they subcontracting any of their process of recruitment, so that you can truly know, is it the company that you hired to conduct recruitment, or are they also subcontracting that work, where we tend to see a lot of vulnerability and exploitation happen.
Thank you so much, Joe. That's really clear guidance and a call to action. Rachel, same question to you.
I think one of the reflections that I have following review of the benchmark, but also reflecting on recent conversations I've had with people who've been talking to migrant workers, is the need for businesses and others to engage more and listen directly to what migrant workers themselves want and need. And when I say that, I think it's also looking at the decent work agenda overall. So yes, of course, looking at repayment of recruitment fees. Yes, of course, looking at things like retention of passports and other identity documents, but also looking more widely in terms of, for example, the ability of migrant workers to be able to go home and visit families. So really looking at a much wider discussion around forced labour, because my slight concern is, I think we are, as businesses, focusing a lot on recruitment fees. It's absolutely critical, but we shouldn't do that in isolation of the overall elements and indicators of forced labour. And I think taking a pragmatic approach and to be guided by migrant workers in terms of the approach that we take.
Thank you, Rachel. And Anja, finally, same question to you.
Yeah, I think I will be quite brief. My message is quite simple. We have seen in this benchmark that progress is too slow and too low, and we need to change this. And I think to do so, we need all of you. We really need to collaborate across different stakeholders and make forced labor a priority.
Thank you so much, guys. Okay, I'm going to jump straight into the questions because we have just 10 more minutes. So let me see. Veronica has very kindly filtered the questions to my chat. So Justin has asked about the scope of the companies that we cover. So just very quickly, their inclusion criteria is based on market capitalization across the 3 high-risk sectors, and then the percentage of revenues derived from own branded products. So it is the market capitalization is kind of key metric there. Second question, your findings seem to support the conclusion that legislation has a role in shifting behaviour, e.g. more transparency in Australia and the UK, if memory serves right, that's correct. Particularly Australia, less so in the UK. Is this also translating into more remediation? So these companies seem to have moved past policies to supply chain mapping and some disclosure, but potentially a lack of clear engagement with findings. Rosie, I might ask you to respond to this if you can.
Yeah, I think it's a good observation that there is some stronger transparency linked to the legislative requirements. I think we can't necessarily make the assertion that it is leading to stronger remediation. I think while we see perhaps stronger disclosure around the implementation of policies and processes, things like the disclosure of risk, and possibly, yeah, I think you mentioned supply chain tracing as well, transparency, but I don't think we, I don't think we could yet say that that is leading to a stronger sort of outcomes for workers or remediation. I think we're still seeing that missing from, the majority of company disclosure.
Thanks, Rosie. So another question for us on the recruitment fee repayment. Are these companies that contributed to reimbursing workers for costs, or was it that they had their suppliers repay all fees? Rosie.
Yeah, great question. This is actually mostly, well, in all cases, it is suppliers making repayments of fees to the workers. And in most cases, we do see companies describing how they're working with suppliers to support that process, not in terms of financial support, but in terms of the process, in terms of determining the amounts for remediation, working with other stakeholders to verify this. But we haven't seen companies financially supporting the remediation of fees for suppliers.
Thanks, Rosie. And then a final one, maybe for us, but also I'll hand it over to the panel. Maybe Rachel, you might have an insight into this as well. Do you have recommendations related to the type of methodology for human rights risk assessments that companies should consider? Any examples of good practice for risk assessments that you've identified in your analysis? So Rosie, maybe I'll hand it over initially to you to just talk about maybe our methodology and good practice that we've seen. And Rachel, if you want to jump in on anything from Unilever's side, that would be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have seen good practices. I think off the top of my head, like the types of practices that we would see as particularly strong are those risk assessment processes that engage stakeholders as part of that process, as well as use a variety of sources to identify, assess, understand different risks, both in terms of locations, commodities, groups of workers that are high risk. And quite often, I think we would see in the strongest disclosure from companies kind of specific impact assessments as well. So as well as having a sort of a generalized risk assessment process to understand human rights impacts, also sort of doing a deep dive into commodities that have been identified as high risk. So a palm oil impact assessment, for example, or a coffee impact assessment in a particular location. And there are certainly some good practice examples in our report and also in the full data set. But yes, perhaps I'll hand over to Rachel.
I think a couple of examples that we use. So I've already mentioned Diginex. So engaging directly with workers through the use of technology. We're also using that to try and use it in advance of an audit. So that's giving the auditor more of a direction of where to focus to make an audit more targeted. And I always say audits with all the caveats that we know that this is just a snapshot in time. I think two other areas that we're looking at, but we need to do more, is around community-based monitoring. So that's particularly in agriculture, particularly in palm, and also ground truthing. So I think going forward, the reality is the more that we can engage directly with workers on the ground in terms of that risk assessment, they know better than anyone where the risks are, the better. But I think it's fair to say that as businesses, we do need to do more work in that area, and we are still learning.
Thanks, Rachel. And then I think maybe another question for us, Rosie, in terms of grievance mechanisms, is there evidence that where there are several helplines in operation, that there is confusion for workers? Most retailers have one or ask us to put them up from a partner. Is it time for just one number?
I'm not sure that we do have that kind of insight into information. I think that for companies with multiple kind of high-risk supply chain contexts, I think that could be challenging, because we sometimes see that that companies would partner with a particular organization in a particular location, take the ISRA Institute, for example, and workers there would have access to this helpline, and in other contexts they perhaps wouldn't. So yeah, I'm not sure about the one hotline. I don't think we have that kind of insight from our data, but yeah, maybe if anybody else in the panel has thoughts.
Maybe just on that, I mean, I know our union colleagues would say that freedom of association is the most effective way for issues and concerns to be raised. I would make that point. I think also it's really important that grievances are dealt with at the point closest to where actually the impact has happened and when the concern is. So I think, you know, from our position, we need to work with our suppliers to make certain that there are operational level grievance mechanisms at the supplier site. Now, obviously, if those mechanisms are not effective, then there must be an ability for workers of our suppliers to be able to raise concerns, which they can do through the our ethics point. But really fundamentally, it is best for those issues to be raised at that level. I do think that, particularly when you look at commodities, there should be more of a discussion around grievance mechanisms that are also at the commodity level, and not just necessarily. I think the point that maybe the questioner is getting at is it is confusing for workers to have lots of different avenues. And actually, I do think if businesses, both suppliers and purchasers, came together and worked with expert organisations and third parties to have one almost grievance ombudsman in particular commodities where we know the risk is high, then I think that is something that we should be looking at, because I do think fundamentally we need to be guided by what is most beneficial and easiest for the grievance raisers, for the rights holders themselves. And I do think at the moment things can be a little bit complex and confusing.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. We have one question that's come in for you specifically, I mean, Unilever rather. So how is Unilever leading on with worker voices as mentioned? So I guess examples of stakeholder engagement, freedom of association, and in terms of supporting ethical recruitment, how, if at all, does Unilever incentivize ethical recruitment within its supply chains? Is it a matter of penalization for lack of compliance, or is there more to it?
I think it has to be. So it's first and foremost about awareness raising and capability building. And so actually just, I don't like the word training, but building the awareness of suppliers in particular high-risk countries, as you put in your first presentation, whether that's in Southeast Asia, whether it's in the Gulf, to really explain what do we mean by ethical recruitment and what's it actually mean to map your supply chain to understand at what point workers could have paid for fees. So I think it is about that prevention piece, which is, I think, the thread that's been running through all the findings of the benchmark. But yes, where we have also been clear, so we've had the employer pays principle in our now responsible partner policy since 2017. It's a contractual requirement. So where we have been clear on that requirement and fees are still being paid, and particularly those high fees, which really are indications of debt bondage. And as I mentioned, we do talk about that in our UK Modern Slavery Act transparency statement. Then yes, we do work with our suppliers and expert third party organisations to really work on that remediation. And I think maybe just, on that point, it is obviously these are then large amounts that need to be repaid, and they must be repaid. But that again, I think, is a real push for businesses to say, actually, it's far better for you to understand who you are working with in terms of recruitment agencies, and really push those agencies to not charge the fees, so that you can prevent that, rather than the customer coming along and saying, we've identified this issue, for example, in an audit or other means, and now you do need to put the means in place to remediate the fees, which then of course puts huge amounts of pressure on a business. So I think we need to get that right. We need to build capability and awareness raising, but absolutely, as Joe is saying, we do need to really look at the true cost of recruitment and employment, and indeed actually all those other elements. Yes, recruitment fees, but all the other elements of actually the true cost of labour, and they do need to be properly factored into costs. And that's why, going back to our living wage and living income commitment, we do also say that we need to look at advocacy, but we also do need to look at purchasing practices. And I think that's one of the biggest unlocks going forward.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And we are 1 minute over time. So I just want to thank everybody for joining today. I want to thank our wonderful panel, Rachel, Anja, and Joe, for their time and expertise. Please do read the benchmark findings, download the resources, engage with the content. Reach out to us if you have any questions. We're always happy to engage. Yeah, thanks again for joining, and yeah, hope to see you soon and talk to you soon. Thanks.